Bismarck Sea, March 3, 1943. 0600 hours. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, commander of the Lae Resupply Convoy, stands on the bridge of his flagship, watching 8 destroyers escort 8 fully loaded transport ships across waters the Imperial Navy considers their own. The convoy carries the 51st Division's long-awaited reinforcements, 6,900 soldiers, promised to Lieutenant General Hatazō Adachi at Lae. Kimura has every reason to believe they'll arrive safely. For over a year, Japanese warships have sailed these routes, unchallenged by American surface forces. What Admiral Kimura cannot, fairly to what no Japanese officer could imagine, is that American engineers in Australian workshops have turned medium bombers into weapons that will make these waters a graveyard. Within 4 hours, modified B-25 Mitchell bombers armed with 850 caliber machine guns will turn his convoy into wreckage scattered across the Bismarck Sea. The Japanese Navy's confidence comes from experience, from Pearl Harbor and the Java Sea, from the poor accuracy of high-altitude American bombers, and from faith that their destroyers' anti-aircraft guns can repel any low-flying attackers. Captain Tamichihara, commanding the destroyer Shigure, has made this journey between Rabaul and Lae many times. He knows the Americans have tried everything: high-level bombing runs that rarely hit, torpedo attacks that expose the attackers, and medium-altitude strikes easily dodged by evasive maneuvers. Imperial Navy doctrine has clear procedures for dealing with air assaults, swift evasive turns, concentrated anti-aircraft fire, and fighter support from the 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul. These methods have worked well enough that Admiral Gunichi Mikawa approved the convoy, even knowing it would likely be detected. Japanese commanders view aerial warfare differently from their American counterparts, seeing it primarily as contests between ships and level bombers or torpedo planes, battles where disciplined fire and sharp maneuvering could defeat most attacks. Commander Yasumi Doi aboard the destroyer. Tokitsukaze has drilled his gun crews relentlessly, teaching them to track and lead targets precisely and to keep firing under pressure. The convoy's defenses include over 100 anti-aircraft guns, dozens of machine guns, and dual-purpose 5-inch weapons on the destroyers, forming what Japanese doctrine calls an umbrella of steel. These defenses have previously downed or driven off Allied aircraft, giving the crews confidence that they can withstand whatever comes. Each transport carries more than troops, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and vital equipment needed to sustain the Japanese foothold in New Guinea. The largest, Kembumaru, displaces more than 6,000 tons and carries a full regiment of the 51st Division. The soldiers, briefed about the risk of air attack, trust in the Navy's protection and prepare for a short, secure voyage. The convoy maintains precise formation, destroyers screening the transports ready to counter submarines or aircraft. Their tactics, honed over 2 years of war, have served well so far. But on March 3, 1943, things will be different. Japanese lookouts are the first to notice approaching aircraft from the south. Lieutenant Commander Ikada aboard a Sashio reports multiple formations at medium altitude, what appears to be the familiar pattern of B-17s and B-25s at around 7,000 feet. It's the kind of attack they've faced before. Gun crews swing their weapons skyward, calculating range and deflection, ready to unleash the defensive fire that has worked so many times before. What they don't see are the other aircraft, coming in almost at wave height. Modified B-25 Mitchells, unlike anything they've ever encountered. The transformation of the B-25 into a low-level strafer marks one of the Pacific War's most significant innovations. Frustrated by the inaccuracy of conventional bombing, Major Paul Pappy Gunn, a former Navy pilot turned Army Air Forces officer, realized that hitting moving ships from high altitude was futile. Torpedo attacks, meanwhile, demanded training and equipment the Army Air Forces lacked. Working with North American Aviation's Jack Fox at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, Gunn began reconfiguring the B-25, replacing the Bombardier station with a cluster of forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns. Early versions had 4 guns, later expanded to 8, reinforcing the nose, redistributing weight, and adding ammunition storage took extensive experimentation. But the result was devastating. These guns fired armor-piercing incendiary rounds capable of penetrating destroyer decks and igniting fuel and ammunition. Each gun fired 850 rounds per minute. 8 together unleashed nearly 7,000 rounds, enough to shred a ship's superstructure and silence gun crews within seconds. Survivors would later describe the horror of watching a B-25's nose erupt in flashes, knowing what was coming next. At the same time, pilots developed skip bombing, a technique to bounce bombs across the water into ships' hulls. Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group perfected the method, discovering that bombs dropped from 200–250 feet would skip like stones before exploding beside or against their targets. It required precision and nerve, but the results were far deadlier than traditional bombing. Crews practiced endlessly near Port Moresby, learning exact distances and timing. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, saw the power of combining these two tactics, skip bombing and strafing, and called the modified planes commerce destroyers. By early 1943, the 3rd Attack Group had fully converted its B-25s, with Major Edward Larner's 90th Squadron leading the way in refining these new strike techniques. Their standard attack profile was daring: approach at 1,000–1,500 feet, drop to wave height 2 miles out, and accelerate toward the target. At 1,500 yards, the pilot opened fire, raking the ship with armor-piercing rounds before releasing bombs at point blank. Range. Admiral Kimura's first hint that something unprecedented is unfolding comes when high-flying B-17s begin their runs. Every Japanese gun turns skyward, filling the air with tracers. The barrage is impressive, but that's exactly what the Americans planned. While Japanese guns blaze at the high-altitude bombers, 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters and 12 B-25 strafers of the 3rd Attack Group come in at sea level from the southwest, so low that their propellers churn up spray from the ocean. Major Edward Larner leads the attack in his B-25 Ruthless. As he roars toward the destroyer Shirayuki at 280 miles per hour, he can see sailors on deck pointing in disbelief. They've seen B-25s before, but never like this, never bristling with forward guns, never flying this low. At 1,200 yards, Larner opens fire. 8 streams of 50 caliber rounds tear through the air, forming solid lines of light toward Shirayuki. The impact is immediate and devastating. Hundreds of incendiary rounds rip through the destroyer's bridge and superstructure, shattering glass and tearing through steel. Anti-aircraft positions fall silent as crews are wiped out almost instantly. One of the few survivors, Ensign Takashi Mieta, would later recall the attack as like being inside a furnace of steel and fire. Caught in the path of a massive metal-cutting saw, the captain and most of the bridge crew were struck down within seconds by gunfire that sparked and flashed as it tore through steel bulkheads. Larner held his attack run for 8 seconds, unleashing over 900 rounds into Shirayuki before releasing 2 500-pound bombs that skipped across the water like stones, slamming into the destroyer's hull just below the waterline. The bombs, fitted with 5-second delay fuses, penetrated Shirayuki's hull before detonating. The explosions broke the destroyer's back and tore open massive holes that flooded her engine rooms within minutes. As Larner pulled up, his gunner swept the decks with turret-mounted 50 caliber fire. Shirayuki was already listing heavily to port, her crew abandoning their guns to battle flooding they couldn't control. Behind Larner, 11 more B-25s were selecting targets across the convoy. Their pilots were astonished by how paralyzed the Japanese ships seemed under this new kind of attack. Lieutenant John Hennebrey, flying the Hag, targeted the transport Kakushi Maru, walking his 8-gun burst from bow to stern. His tracers punched through the bridge, destroyed cargo gear, and silenced anti-aircraft guns before his skip bombs ripped into the hull. The Kakushi Maru's captain tried to steer clear, but his helm was unresponsive. The helmsman and bridge crew were already dead, cut down by 50 caliber rounds that turned the bridge into a scene of shattered steel and bodies. Adding to the destruction, the Beaufighters opened up with their 420mm cannons and 6 303 machine guns, concentrating on anti-aircraft guns and bridge crews to suppress any organized defense. Flight Sergeant Fred Cassidy of No. 30 Squadron approached the transport Tio Maru at 500 feet, diving to mast height in the final moments. His cannons ripped through the ship's superstructure. Cassidy later described watching the bridge disintegrate under explosive rounds, Japanese sailors thrown into the air, lifeboats splintering to pieces as his fire found them. Skip bombing proved devastatingly effective. One bomb after another bounced across the waves, striking Japanese hulls at the waterline. The delayed fuses ensured each bomb pierced deep before detonating. The transport Nojima took 3 skip bomb hits in seconds, the blasts tearing her open like a can, flooding holds packed with soldiers in full gear. Trapped in confined spaces, few stood a chance. Witnesses later recalled hearing their screams, even over the roar of engines and ammunition explosions. Commander Yasumi, Doi aboard Tokitsukaze, watched in horror as his trained gun crews were wiped out by 50 caliber fire, their bodies torn apart by heavy rounds. He tried to rally a defense, shouting orders to redirect fire at the low-flying attackers, but his gunners were dying faster than they could respond. Those who survived were too shaken to return fire as B-25s roared past, their noses flickering with muzzle flashes. The Japanese Navy had never faced anything like this. Medium bombers transformed into flying gunships, bristling with forward-firing weapons. No tactics existed to counter an assault combining strafing and bombing at wave-top height. The destroyer Arashio attempted to move between the attackers and the transports, her captain trying to shield the convoy. But the maneuver made her a prime target. 3 B-25s focused their combined 24 guns on her, pouring over 2,000 rounds per minute into the destroyer. Her superstructure was shredded, everyone on the bridge killed, fire control destroyed, and the rudder jammed hard to starboard. Out of control, Arashio collided with the transport Nojima. Both ships locked together, fires spreading rapidly as crews failed to contain them. From his flagship, Admiral Kimura watched his convoy fall apart. The assault defied everything in Japanese naval doctrine. The Americans weren't conducting torpedo runs or high-altitude bombing, tactics that could be anticipated or avoided. Instead, they dove in at point-blank range, their guns transforming each ship into a slaughterhouse. Kimura ordered evasive maneuvers, but the B-25s were too fast, too numerous, attacking from every direction. Their 8-gun noses spat streams of fire at any ship attempting to keep formation. The transport Oyomaru became a focus when her captain made the fatal mistake of turning broadside, giving the attackers a perfect target. Lieutenant Donald McCullough in Sleepy Time Gal approached from the beam, opening fire at 1,500 yards. His 8 guns poured armor-piercing incendiary rounds into Oyomaru's hull, igniting ammunition and fuel below deck. Secondary explosions ripped open the ship, and McCullough's skip bombs finished the job, breaking her in half. The ship sank so quickly that nearly all 1,500 soldiers aboard perished. The entire assault lasted barely 15 minutes. Yet in that short time, the once organized convoy was reduced to burning wrecks. The destroyer Asagumo, attempting to rescue survivors, was attacked by 2 B-25s. Their guns cleared her decks before skip bombs tore open her hull. Japanese sailors in the water thought themselves safe until the aircraft returned, strafing lifeboats and swimmers. The American crews were following strict orders. No reinforcements were to reach New Guinea. By 10:15 a.m., as the last B-25s vanished southward, Admiral Kimura surveyed the devastation. The Imperial Japanese Navy had just witnessed a turning point in Pacific warfare. Of his 8 transports, all were sinking or already gone, burning markers of destruction drifting on the waves. 4 of his 8 destroyers, including his flagship Shirayuki, were lost. The survivors were damaged, their decks strewn with dead and wounded, their superstructures riddled with bullet holes. The human cost became clear as rescue efforts began. The waters were filled with bodies and debris, but few survivors remained. Of the 6,900 troops who departed from Rabaul, fewer than 1,200 would ultimately reach Lae. Most were rescued by Japanese submarines that arrived after nightfall. The majority of the 51st Division was destroyed, not in ground combat where they could resist, nor by naval gunfire, where some warning might have been possible, but by modified bombers that turned their transports into fire traps within minutes. Captain Tamichi Hara, one of the few senior officers to survive, later wrote that the attack was unlike anything they had ever faced or imagined possible. He described how the B-25s appeared to slice their ships in half with concentrated bursts of fire. The psychological effect on the Imperial Japanese Navy proved even greater than the physical destruction. As news of the convoy's annihilation spread, naval officers who had once dismissed American air power as ineffective were forced to acknowledge a new reality. The Americans had developed a weapon for which traditional naval defenses offered no protection. Each B-25 carried .50 caliber machine guns in its nose, more forward-firing firepower than most destroyers possessed. Unlike ship-mounted guns, these weapons could be directed with the agility of aircraft. Japanese naval doctrine, built on surface battles and conventional aerial attacks, had no answer for flying gunships capable of erasing convoys in minutes. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received the Bismarck Sea report in visible shock, realizing immediately that Japan could no longer risk surface ships within range of American aircraft. He understood that the Navy's failure to protect even an escorted convoy meant resupply and reinforcement of outposts would become nearly impossible. This effectively sealed the fate of Japanese garrisons across the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Yamamoto ordered a review of convoy tactics and anti-aircraft defenses, but privately admitted there might be no true counter to the American strafing bombers. The transformation of the B-25 Mitchell from a standard medium bomber into a deadly gunship showcased American engineering and adaptability at their best, driven by necessity rather than doctrine. Mechanics working under primitive conditions created a weapon that outperformed purpose-built attack aircraft against shipping, proving American ingenuity and flexibility in combat. The 8-gun nose configuration became standard on later B-25J models, with North American aviation incorporating field modifications into factory production, allowing the aircraft to mount up to 18 forward-firing .50 caliber guns. Following the victory at the Bismarck Sea, B-25 Strafers spread across the Southwest Pacific, appearing wherever Japanese shipping tried to move. The 345th Bombardment Group, known as the Air Apaches, received their B-25s in August 1943 and immediately began hunting Japanese coastal traffic near New Guinea. Their planes, decorated with shark mouths, became symbols of terror to Japanese sailors. The 38th Bombardment Group also converted to strafers, developing new tactics for harbor and anchorage attacks, including radar-guided night raids. By late 1943, Japanese naval officers reported that daytime movement of any vessel larger than a fishing boat was suicidal within B-25 range. The strain on Japanese logistics was severe. Forced to rely on submarines and fast destroyers operating at night, the Navy could only deliver a fraction of previous convoy cargo. As a result, Japanese troops across the Pacific faced growing shortages of food, ammunition, and medicine. The garrison at Lae, the intended destination of the March 3rd convoy, never received proper resupply and was evacuated in September 1943. Those who escaped endured deadly marches through jungle and mountains, with many dying from hunger and disease. Japanese efforts to counter the B-25 strafers achieved little. Their speed and firepower made them difficult targets for fighters, while their low-level attacks neutralized heavy anti-aircraft guns. The Japanese even resorted to suicide ramming tactics, but such desperate measures failed to stop the relentless destruction of their shipping. By mid-1944, Japan's merchant marine had lost over 60% of its tonnage, much of it to B-25 strafers and skip-bombing attacks that turned cargo ships into burning wrecks within minutes. The B-25s continued their deadly work through 1944, expanding their missions to include Japanese airfields. Their heavy forward guns proved just as effective at destroying aircraft on the ground. The August 17-21, 1943 raids on Wewak demonstrated this versatility. B-25s destroyed over 170 Japanese aircraft in a series of low-level assaults that left the 4th Air Army nearly defenseless. Japanese pilots described the terror of seeing B-25s racing in at treetop height, their nose guns shredding everything in their path before bombs completed the devastation. During the Battle of Biak in May-June 1944, B-25 Strafers again demonstrated their value against Japanese naval reinforcements. On June 8th, 10 B-25s from the 17th Reconnaissance Squadron attacked a destroyer group, riddling the destroyer Harusame with incendiary rounds before skip-bombing her to the bottom. The strike forced Japan to abandon the reinforcement mission, leaving the Biak garrison isolated, a clear example of how B-25 strafers could shape entire campaigns by denying Japan control of the sea. The aircrews who flew these modified B-25s developed a unique esprit de corps, decorating their aircraft with elaborate nose art and names like Dirty Dora, Pluto and Hell's Angel, symbols of their aggressive role. They knew they were flying something exceptional, an aircraft that combined the range and payload of a bomber with firepower rivaling that of many fighters. They took pride in their precision strikes against Japanese shipping, knowing each sunken vessel weakened the enemy's ability to fight. Japanese survivors of B-25 attacks carried lasting psychological scars. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto, who escaped the transport Kaikusi Maru, spoke of recurring nightmares about American planes with 8 eyes of death. Commander Toshio Abe, who witnessed the Bismarck Sea disaster, reported that his crew would freeze at the sound of approaching aircraft engines. Haunted by the fear that strafers could appear at any moment, the effectiveness of the B-25 strafers forced a complete rethinking of Japanese strategy. Commanders now assumed that any daylight operation risked detection and destruction. Movements that had been routine in 1942 became impossible by late 1943, driving the Japanese to rely on increasingly desperate methods to support their garrisons. The infamous Tokyo Express destroyer runs to Guadalcanal were one adaptation, using speed and night cover to evade air attack, but even these suffered losses as radar-equipped B-25s began hunting after dark. By early 1944, Japanese naval reports described the B-25 strafer as the most feared weapon in the Pacific, more destructive than submarines, more accurate than dive bombers, and more versatile than torpedo planes. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, admitted in a classified report that the Imperial Navy had no effective defense against mass strafing attacks. He recommended that surface vessels avoid operating within 500 miles of American air bases, effectively conceding vast regions of the Pacific to U.S. control. From forward bases, B-25s now dominated the skies and seas, covering immense areas and ensuring that Japanese forces could neither move nor resupply without catastrophic losses. Australia's contribution to the B-25 strafer force deserves particular acknowledgement, as Royal Australian Air Force crews fought alongside American units throughout the campaign. From 1944 onward, No. 18 Squadron RAF operated B-25 strafers, marked with RAF roundels, but equipped with the same formidable 8-gun nose configuration. Australian pilots gained a reputation for their bold attacks on Japanese coastal shipping across the Netherlands East Indies. Their detailed knowledge of local waters often enabled them to locate and strike targets that American crews might overlook. The B-25 strafer continued to evolve technically throughout the war, with later models featuring rocket launchers, improved gun sights, and even trials with 75mm cannons for use against larger vessels. The B-25J-22, regarded as the ultimate strafer variant, carried 8 nose guns, 4 package guns mounted on the fuselage, 2 in the top turret, 2 in the waist positions, and 2 in the tail. In total, 18 50-caliber machine guns provided devastating firepower from nearly every direction. These late-war models functioned as true flying arsenals, capable of annihilating entire convoys independently. When German and Italian military observers learned through intelligence about American strafer tactics, they expressed astonishment at the idea of turning medium bombers into heavily armed gunships. The Luftwaffe attempted similar modifications to its Junkers Ju-88 aircraft by adding forward-firing cannons for anti-shipping roles, yet never matched the concentrated power of the B-25's 8-gun nose. Italian forces in the Mediterranean employed related skip-bombing methods with their SM-79 torpedo bombers, but lacked the forward armament needed to suppress anti-aircraft. Fire as effectively as the B-25, the influence of the B-25 strafer extended far beyond its immediate battlefield success. Its effectiveness shaped post-war aircraft design and military doctrine, directly inspiring the heavily armed gunship concept, later embodied in aircraft such as the AC-47 Spooky and AC-130 Spectre used in Vietnam and later conflicts. The practice of integrating powerful forward-firing weapons into multi-purpose aircraft became a lasting feature of American air strategy, tracing its origins back to the modified Pappy guns configurations first tested in Australia. Japanese historians, writing after the war, recognized the B-25 Strafer as one of the most significant tactical innovations of the Pacific conflict, par with radar or code-breaking in its overall impact. Professor Masanori of Japan's Defense University wrote that the Strafer bomber not only destroyed ships, but also shattered Japan's entire naval warfare concept, forcing an early end to offensive operations. The inability to shield shipping from these low-level attacks hastened Japan's defeat by preventing the massing of forces for counter-offensives. Individual B-25 missions soon became legendary among the crews who flew them. One notable example was the November 2, 1943 raid on Simpson Harbor at Rabaul. 70 B-25 Strafers swept across the harbor at mast height, raking ships with gunfire while skip bombs tore into larger vessels moored below. Japanese witnesses later described the scene as a cauldron of burning oil and exploding ammunition within minutes, with rescue attempts rendered impossible by continuing strafing runs over the docks. As experience grew, the modification process became increasingly refined. By late 1943, field teams could convert a standard B-25 into a Strafer within a week, installing 8 nose guns, strengthening mounts, expanding ammunition storage, and perfecting ammunition feeds to prevent jamming during aggressive maneuvers. Gun alignment was adjusted for maximum concentration at optimal range, and firing controls were adapted to let pilots choose between selective bursts or full 8-gun salvos. Skip bombing techniques also evolved as pilots learned to adjust their tactics for different ship types and conditions. They discovered that approaching at a slight angle, rather than directly broadside, made them harder to track while maintaining bombing accuracy. Tests revealed that dropping bombs from about 60 feet at 340 yards produced the best skip pattern, with bombs bouncing once or twice before hitting near the waterline. Fuse delays were modified according to target: 4 seconds for transport ships, 6 for armored warships. Japanese naval efforts to counter the Strafer threat included mounting additional light anti-aircraft guns wherever possible. However, these defenses proved largely ineffective against the overwhelming volume of synchronized 50 caliber fire. Some captains resorted to extreme maneuvers, even halting their vessels or reversing course abruptly. But the B-25's speed and agility allowed pilots to adjust aim rapidly. Radar-guided guns offered limited improvement, but by the time such systems appeared, Allied air superiority was overwhelming, leaving Japanese ships exposed. Maintenance crews supporting B-25 Strafer operations also played a crucial role. Operating under harsh tropical conditions, they worked tirelessly to keep the modified aircraft serviceable. The 8 nose guns demanded constant upkeep to prevent corrosion. Ammunition feeds required cleaning after every sortie, and the strain of low-level flying increased wear on engines and airframes. Mechanics labored through humid nights to prepare aircraft for dawn missions, aware that a single mechanical failure during an attack could be fatal for their crews. Intelligence support proved equally vital. Coast watchers, submarines, and codebreakers supplied timely reports on Japanese ship movements. B-25 squadrons often received their target data mere hours before takeoff, allowing them to strike when enemy vessels were most exposed. With the B-25's range and firepower, few Japanese ships within 500 miles of an Allied base were ever truly safe. However, the human cost of these operations was high. Low-level strafing missions against heavily defended targets led to severe losses. The U.S. 3rd Attack Group alone lost over 40 B-25s during the war, most destroyed while flying through intense ground fire. The psychological strain of charging directly at enemy guns, maintaining steady flight under fire, and pulling up only seconds before impact weighed heavily on crews. Many veteran pilots suffered from lasting nervous exhaustion after repeated missions. Forced to withdraw from combat duty, many crews reached their breaking point after countless missions watching tracer rounds streak toward their aircraft. The success of the B-25 Strafer profoundly shaped American tactical doctrine, showing that innovative field modifications could outperform purpose-built designs. The support of commanders like General Kenny, who encouraged unconventional thinking even when it challenged official doctrine, proved essential to American victories in the Pacific. The Strafer program demonstrated that granting resourceful individuals like Pappy Gunn the tools and freedom to experiment could yield revolutionary results that redefined warfare itself. Japanese survivors of Strafer attacks often described their horror at the weapon's impersonal efficiency. The 8-gun nose turned killing into an industrial process. Unlike dive bombing or torpedo attacks that relied on pilot skill, the B-25 Strafer merely aimed its nose at a target and unleashed a torrent of fire that obliterated everything in its path. One Japanese officer compared it to being attacked by a flying machine gun nest, impossible to suppress, impossible to evade, arriving suddenly to turn ships into blazing wrecks within seconds. By 1945, as crews prepared for the planned invasion of Japan, Strafer tactics had evolved further. They developed new methods for striking suicide boats, coastal defenses, and industrial facilities. The 8-gun nose proved equally effective against ground targets, tearing apart locomotives, destroying radar sites, and silencing anti-aircraft guns during major raids. Plans were drawn for massive Strafer sweeps across Japanese harbors to eliminate the last remnants of the Imperial Navy before the invasion. Japan's surrender made such missions unnecessary, but the B-25 Strafer's legacy endured. Its influence remains clear in modern military aviation, where heavily armed ground attack aircraft still hold a central place in tactical planning. The A-10 Thunderbolt II Warthog, with its massive 30mm cannon, stands as a direct descendant of the B-25 Strafer, built to deliver overwhelming firepower at close range. The success of gunship aircraft from Vietnam to Afghanistan can be traced back to those Australian workshops where Pappy Gunn first mounted 8 machine guns in a bomber's nose. Decades after the war, veterans of Strafer units gathered at reunions to share memories of missions that once seemed suicidal but proved devastatingly effective. They recalled the smell of cordite filling the cockpit, the vibration shaking the airframe as all 8 guns fired at once, and the sight of enemy ships disintegrating under their fire. They knew they had flown something unique in aviation history, an improvised weapon that outperformed many purpose-built aircraft. It was a testament to American ingenuity and adaptability. In post-war analyses, the Japanese military identified the B-25 Strafer as one of 3 key innovations that doomed their empire, alongside radar and code breaking. Their inability to protect shipping from Strafer attacks crippled Japan's island-based supply system. Garrisons starved as reinforcements and resources never arrived. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, the final commander of the combined fleet, admitted simply that the 8-gun B-25 destroyed Japan's ability to move by sea, an ability vital to an island nation's survival. The Sao B-25 Strafer's technical specifications became legendary among aviation enthusiasts. Many marveled at the boldness of fitting 8 50 caliber machine guns into an aircraft never designed for such firepower. Each gun weighed about 64 pounds, fired 850 rounds per minute, and required intricate feed systems to maintain continuous fire. Together, the 8 guns weighed over 500 pounds, not including ammunition, demanding careful balance adjustments. Each gun carried 400 rounds, giving a total of 3,200 rounds, roughly 30 seconds of continuous fire, though pilots rarely fired for more than 8 seconds at once. The B-25 Strafer represented more than an effective weapon. It embodied the American wartime approach: innovation, adaptability, and bold execution. While other nations might have spent years designing a specialized Strafer, Americans modified existing bombers in the field, tested them in battle, and refined them through experience. The willingness to experiment, take risks, and trust frontline ingenuity over distant planners proved decisive in the Pacific campaign. By war's end, B-25 Strafer crews were among the most decorated in the Army Air Forces. Their missions directly contributed to the isolation and defeat of Japanese forces across the Pacific. The presidential unit citations, distinguished flying crosses, and silver stars they earned reflected both the danger and success of their operations. Yet no medal could fully express the impact of their Service, the site of 8 streams of tracer fire, shredding enemy convoys and changing the course of battle in minutes over the Bismarck. Say the final B-25 Strafer mission took place on August 14, 1945. The same day Japan announced its surrender. Aircraft from the 345th Bombardment Group attacked Japanese ships in the inland sea. Even as the war's end was certain, the 8-gun noses continued to prove their worth, destroying several vessels attempting to flee to Korea. The crews returned to find the war over, their remarkable weapon no longer needed, though the concept they pioneered would influence aviation for generations. In retrospect, the B-25 Strafer stands as perhaps the most successful field modification in military aviation history, transforming a standard medium bomber into a ship-killing force that terrified Japanese naval commanders. From Pappy Gunn's early experiments at Eagle Farm to the mass-produced B-25J-22 with 18 guns, the Strafer story illustrates how innovation, born of necessity, can surpass conventional planning. The 50-caliber guns protruding from the B-25's nose became symbols of American determination and creativity, proving that in modern warfare, adaptability wins wars. Japan's encounter with the Strafer was a lesson in technological shock and tactical evolution, where long-held assumptions about air combat were shattered. In moments over the Bismarck Sea, the Imperial Japanese Navy, heirs of a proud samurai tradition and victors of Tsushima, found themselves powerless against mechanics from Texas and pilots from Kansas who turned bombers into flying fortresses. The 8-gun nose Admiral Kimura saw bearing down on his convoy on March 3, 1943, represented more than just a weapon. It symbolized a new era of warfare, one where innovation overcame tradition, and a handful of modified aircraft crippled an empire's ability to survive.